seconds.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, the third in our series on sacred places and spaces. And today we will have a look at shared facilities and ministries, but I'll say more about that in a moment. So welcome to all of you who are here in this cyber room, this room in which we're gathering, and all of you who will be checking in on this later on the YouTube channels or various websites. My name is Cheryl Toth. I'm your moderator for this today, and I would like to begin by taking a moment to acknowledge where we are. So wherever you may be physically, think for a moment about the land on which you are living and the peoples who have lived there before you. I'm speaking to you from Regina, so I am on Treaty 4 land, and I want to acknowledge that this is this place in which I and we live and work and worship as the traditional homeland and gathering place of the Mckillop or Cree peoples, the Assiniboine, Saulteaux, and Métis nations. We recognize that we as Christian faith communities have made mistakes in the past that have caused wounds and harms, and that carries until to this day in terms of the intergenerational harm that has been done. So we seek healing and reconciliation by telling the truth and seeking to understand the truth within one another. And we recognize that we are all relations and all treaty people. So we begin today by saying who our speaker is and what the topic is, and then we'll have an opening prayer. Our speaker today is the Reverend Dr. Sandra Beardsall, who many of you, as I could tell from as you entered in, already know. But for those of you who don't know her, she is an ordained minister in the United Church of Canada with pastoral experience in Newfoundland, Labrador, and Ontario, and a lot of experience on the prairie. She came to Saskatchewan for a faculty appointment at St. Andrew's College. In her pastoral work, she has served an ecumenical or shared ministry parish, which was Anglican-United. Her area of research brings together historical, pastoral, and ecumenical concerns in the service of congregational ministry on the prairies and Points West. She serves as a member of the World Council of Churches Faith and Order Commission and has been a member of the Anglican-United Church Dialogue and the Roman Catholic United Church Dialogue. With Mitzi Budde, I'm hoping I'm saying that name right, and William McDonald, she is the author of Daring to Share, Multi-Denominational Congregations in the United States and Canada. Her topic today is sharing sacred spaces, facilities, and ministries. And she will discuss with us the many and varied ways denominations can work together in ministry and in the sharing of facilities. We'll take a moment to begin with prayer. Loving and gracious God, we thank you on this day in which we remember St. Patrick for the various traditions and saints who are celebrated within our communities, for the richness of the way in which you have led us and continue to lead us as your people. We thank you for the gifts that our speaker brings to us today, and ask that you help us to enter into this ecumenical journey as we consider the ways in which we might share ministry and facilities for the good of your people and the care of the world. In Christ's name, amen. Sandra.
Okay, thank you. Greetings, everyone. It's just wonderful to be with you as as you heard, I do know some of you and some of you I don't. And it's just great to all be together on this beautiful day that is a harbinger of spring, we hope. And I do look forward to working with you today. I'm going to be using a share screen PowerPoint. I may not see you very well for that reason. And even the chat, I don't always see clearly when I'm busy trying to find where my pointer is for my PowerPoint. So I am really grateful to Cheryl and Nick for organizing these wonderful sessions together. And I know that they will assist me in seeing if you have something you'd like to say, interject or ask. There will be a time towards the end of our time together that I will say, open it up to everybody for conversation and suggestions. But I also hope that if something comes to you along the way, that you will feel free to interact together with us all. So either by a comment in the chat, or if there's something you'd like to ask or say. I know that some of you are very familiar with the topic of sharing ministry and sharing places, and so I know you will be bringing us some expertise in that area. Some of you may not know anything, and so I'm sort of assuming not much knowledge. And so for those of you who are already familiar or who have heard my shtick before, I apologize. And for those of you with good and keen knowledge, please feel free to help us all together learn together. So first thing I will do is begin to share my screen. Now, is that working? Good. Okay, that's great. So this is sharing sacred places and ministries as part of your excellent series that's sharing sacred spaces and places. Places and spaces, maybe. I can never remember which order it was supposed to be. I think it was the other way, right? Now, here's my... So as Cheryl mentioned, it's Happy St. Patrick's Day. I do have my green shamrock earrings, and I saw a few of you wearing green. That's great. And of course, one of the things we think about going along with the whole St. Patrick Irish theme is, of course, what is that? Does any just call it out? What do you see there? Nobody wanted
luck.
Yeah, the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, right? The good luck. That's right. That reminds me, just seeing the field there reminds me that I wanted to tell you I am on Treaty 6 territory, and grateful for the land that we inhabit together with the original people and the Métis people, and for which we look for reconciliation, repair, and a good future together. So anyway, yes, the luck at the end of the rainbow. Well, I always like to say the Irish didn't invent that, Jesus did. With one of his wonderful little tiny parables. And would anybody like to unmute and just read this parable for us? Matthew 13:44. It's there on the screen.
The kingdom of heaven is like treasure hidden in a field, which someone found and hid. Then in his joy, he goes and sells all that he has and buys that field.
Wow, thank you. That's great. So yes, so the kingdom of heaven is like a treasure hidden in a field. Well, so that's kind of like a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow in some ways. And for me, I reflect that parable reminds me of my experience of going to and finding the community church in Churchill Falls, Labrador. Now, I'm a United Church minister, and my first appointment after I was ordained was the southern coast of Labrador. Red Bay and Forto were the main small communities there. But our first meeting of presbytery, which is the sort of oversight body for churches, or was at that time in the United Church, the Labrador Presbytery was meeting it's the first meeting that I attended of them, was meeting in Churchill Falls, in Labrador, in Labrador also, of course. And we had to fly there because there weren't any roads connecting the communities in Labrador. So off we went and discovered this little community church. And what is Churchill Falls is a company town. Some of you may know of it, a huge hydroelectric dam project. It's a corporation, a crown corporation of the province of Newfoundland and Labrador, developed in the 1960s to harness the power of this massive waterfall, taller than Niagara Falls, but not as wide, that sends power throughout the whole eastern seaboard of Canada and the United States. And it was built, so the entire town was built by the corporation. You can only live there if you're employed by the corporation, and they built one church, one small church, and they said, you Christians, there weren't any at that time in the 60s, they weren't even thinking other religions. They assumed most of the people coming would be Christian. They said, you Christians, figure it out. And so this is in the late 60s. The Anglican and the Anglican diocese and the United Church Presbytery got together and said, you know, we could share one ministry together there, and have one minister and one community, and that was called St. Mark's Anglican-United Shared Ministry. But they had to still share the building with the Catholics, right? So the Catholics also worshipped at this same church, and so the church was shared by the Catholics and with the Anglican-United Shared Ministry. So what happened? Well, I've just got some photos from those times a long time ago. You can see I was a little bit younger then when I served in this shared ministry. And in the top left there is me in the middle, and beside me on one side is Father Joe Barry. He was the priest that served the community from a long distance away. He had to come 3 hours on a gravel road, so he didn't come every week. They had a pastoral associate with whom they had reserved sacrament other Sundays, but he came once in a while, and he became a very, very dear friend to me, and then to my husband Bill. And on the other side of me is Sister Ren, and Sister Ren was the youth group leader of the youth group over in this community church that was 3 hours away, Labrador City, from Churchill Falls. And she and I cooked up, along with the Catholic lay worker, a group, teamed up to have big youth group gatherings. So you see them down there on the right hand small lower corner. We got and of course, you know, youth love to be with other youth. So we had wonderful times between the Catholic Anglican United Youth that all gathered together to form a youth group. And then in the top right hand corner, now some of you who are United Church might recognize the guy there. Do you want to call that name out or put it in the chat? I don't see it. So somebody just unmute and say who you think that might be. You should know this person, some of you.
Dan McKay.
Yes, and who is he?
He was moderator of the United Church of Canada.
That's correct.
I think in 1992.
That's right, 92 and to 94. And I got a phone call from one of the officials of the Newfoundland and Labrador Conference of the United Church saying, would you like to have the moderator for Thanksgiving? And I thought, well, I would rather have like maybe something else to eat, but we'll certainly invite him to come and be with us, right? And so we were blessed to have on Thanksgiving Sunday the moderator of the United Church with us. And the person with him there is Mary Norman, a very strong and devoted Roman Catholic parishioner. So we had a joint service because Stan was there and he was the moderator of the whole church, and there we are celebrating together. And the lower left shows you an example of of us sharing ministry together. The person speaking was a member of the Anglican-United Church. He was a lay leader in the church. And then those of us sitting down there included me, and then beside me with the blue stole, the licensed lay Anglican reader, and then beside me on the other side was the Catholic pastoral worker. So again, another time when we were able to have shared services, and people really welcomed these these services where we all shared together, not least because the first service in the morning, and we rotated year by year, which community got which. So for a whole year, the Catholics would have 10 o'clock and the Anglican United would have 11:30, and then the next year we'd switch. And in this town, nobody got up early, and everybody hated having 10 o'clock for their service. So if we shared ministry, we could have the service at 11 and everybody'd be really happy. That's just a little taste of what I experienced. And what I found as I experienced these people together was not only some of these special occasions, but just this rich willingness to kind of to work together, to let go of something of ourselves in order to be together, to be in ministry in a way that I had never experienced with other Christians beyond my denomination before. So it was a really special experience. So that was my treasure in a field that got me into all this. So today, this is what I'd like us to just look at. Now I've called it a fairly brief history because people always say, don't do too much history, but I teach history, right? So I can't resist. So I'm going to tell you some history about Christians sharing places in ministries, and then a little bit about why they do it. Then then a few more amazing stories about Christians sharing in ministry. Then some sort of more practical stuff about how people get started and ways to go about that. And that's also a place where people that are here, like Ann Salmon and others who have powerful experience of shared ministries can jump in and make sure we hear the goods on that. And then we're going to open it up for more sharing and questions, and follow with a few brief concluding remarks. So that's sort of my pattern. So here we are, you're launching into your history lesson, whether you wanted it or not, right? I like to think that shared ministries, although they probably go back even further than this, but one of the kind of clearest early examples happened in the 16th century. And many of you will know that the 16th century brought us what do we often call it? It starts with R.
Reformation.
Right, yes, the Reformations, where the church, especially in Western Europe, fragmented into different what we now call denominations, and as that was going on, particularly in places like what we now call Germany, there was a lot of turmoil, and one of the things that happened was that as they tried to figure out how to make all this go along, some people in great numbers converted to Lutheranism or to Calvinism, and others wanted to remain in the Catholic Church in communion with Rome. And so this church in Biberach in Germany, which is in Upper Swabia, in Baden-Württemberg, mostly in this community, wanted to be Lutheran, but their prince Charles V had decreed that everybody in his region was going to be Catholic. So what to do about this? He didn't have the resources to police it every Sunday and demand that they worship as Catholics. So they decided to share the church, and they called it Simultankirche. So it's simultaneous churches. And the church had been around for several centuries, a beautiful old church. But they set it up with this very elaborate schedule, because they didn't just each have one service on Sundays, they each had to have several, right? So they started at 5 a.m, rotating services between Lutheran and Catholic. And the Catholics largely met in the chancel because they were a smaller group, and the Lutherans kind of met in the nave mainly. But they had a giant clock which faced both ways, into the nave and into the chancel, because they had to know when it was time to get out and let the other people in. And that church is still going today as a simultankirche. So these things can last. So those were churches that were scattered around Germany. Now, if you want to, as we cross into North America, in the 1700s, we started seeing some building sharing, particularly among immigrants who spoke the same language, even if they had a different church denomination. So in this case, the German-speaking Lutherans and the German-speaking Reformed immigrants especially to Pennsylvania, and in this case, just to Northern Virginia, realized that they had a lot in common. And so they built themselves their own church together. And they created this covenant, and we still today talk about these covenants, these shared ministry agreements, in which they said that everybody would share equally in this. However, they all had to contribute equally to the paying of not only their minister and the building upkeep, but also the schoolmaster who would teach school in the building, and probably and in German, right? So this is one of the earliest examples we have in North America of a formal shared ministry agreement. Now, the church is no longer there, so that little inset picture is a little cairn representing where the church was in these beautiful mountains of Virginia. Well, if you want to come up to Canada, some of you will know some of this story. A very far-flung population across Canada, or what would become Canada and then what became Canada, of North European and North European immigrants, right? And so the churches that came along with the immigrants, particularly the Protestant churches, decided they would cooperate, and especially the Presbyterian and the Methodists, and to some extent the Congregationalists, but they were much smaller and didn't really spread westward in the same way. But they agreed that they would try to get along with each other. Now, it went even further. And so the guy on the left, his name was Reverend Charles Mckillop. And as you can imagine by his name, a good Presbyterian minister who came from Ontario to serve in what was then the frontier town of Lethbridge, Alberta, in 1886. But he came from Eastern Ontario, and he wrote an article back to the Renfrew Times, Renfrew Mercury, newspaper back in Lethbridge. And part of his article was about the church sharing. He says, "There is but one church building here yet, and that belongs to the Presbyterians. The Episcopalians, or Anglicans, hope to have theirs completed and paid for by the end of the year. The Roman Catholics are just now passing around the hat." Then he says, "The greatest harmony prevails between the different denominations. The resident clergy are as Jonathan and David. All clerical sheep stealing is to be abolished. And we think we will have enough to do in fighting his satanic majesty without fighting each other." So a spirit of cooperation, particularly in the West. And one of the early examples we have, that's Gambo, Newfoundland, in the middle there, where they decided to share a building in the 1950s, but they added to the church building so that they had an altar or communion at each end. So one that looked Anglican and one that looked United Church, whatever that meant. And they had the pews shaped so they could flip over, so you could make them look Anglican, or, you know, they would all orient towards the United Chancel or the Anglican Chancel. And there was also sharing that happened in Sifton, Manitoba, where the Ukrainian Catholics shared with the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, and there's a little bit of a sad story about how that unraveled, but it has to do with Ukrainian politics and Russian politics. So the world is small, right? But then a real formal kind of sharing began in the early 1960s, and I'm just going to show you a few examples of that kind of sharing that happened in Canada. Now, one of them is one of the very earliest is the Pinawa Christian Fellowship. Now, Pinawa was another company town in Manitoba, and when they and a lot of the people had moved there from Deep River, Ontario, where they had also collaborated in a shared ministry. So as soon as they got to Manitoba, they said, we want to do the same thing again. And they wanted everybody involved, or as many as they could get. So initially, they had Anglican, Baptist, Lutheran, Mennonite, Presbyterian, and United all in the congregation. It's now formally still Anglican, Mennonite, Presbyterian, and United. The Lutherans withdrew in the 1960s to build later in the 1960s to build their own church, but they share summer worship now with the Pinawa Christian Fellowship, so they still share things together. And I think the fellowship has been worshiping in the Lutheran Church towards the end of COVID, as they came back to worshiping in the space. But where they have been worshiping otherwise is they worship in the school, and they have a beautiful way of setting it up so that you can see a little bit there that it looks like a lovely worship space. It doesn't just look like that they're in the gym of a school, but they have a beautiful way of making it their own while not having the cost of a building. And as I said, the Lutherans withdrew. The Baptists were always small in number, and it wasn't that they really determined to leave, but they sort of dwindled by the 2000s, and so they're no longer formally part of it all. So there's one of the earliest ones, still going, and then I thought I'd show you a kind of middle-aged one. So these have been going on. A middle-aged one. These have been going on now for. These have been going on for a long time, and these, but this one started in about 20 years ago. And so Shell Lake, Saskatchewan, some of you might be familiar with it. They always had a spirit of cooperation. The Anglicans had not had a church for many years, but they worshiped either with Lutherans or United people. They started sharing services more formally in the late 90s, and in 2000 they formally signed what we call ESM, or Ecumenical Shared Ministry Covenant, and they renamed themselves Partners in Worship, which is what they call themselves today. But they're the famous part of their story is that they moved the Lutheran Church onto the United Church property, and they lo and behold, they decided to use one to be kind of the hall and the other would be the church. And guess what? The roof lines fit perfectly together. So that's why I called it perfect pitch. And they worship with a kind of blended liturgy between Lutheran and United. They use elements of both in their worship. We're going to talk a little more about worship in a while, but that's how they handle it. And now I'm going to bring you to a pretty recent one. And this one takes us into 2019. And this is in BC. BC has been the site of many, many shared ministries. We could talk a lot about that and their sharing history, which goes back to the 1960s. But in Fernie, BC, Knox United Church and Christ Anglican Church both loved their buildings, but they could not afford a full-time minister each. But they said if we pooled their resources, they might be able to. And so they began sharing the ministry leadership of the Anglican minister, the Reverend Andrea Brennan, in the fall of 2019. Now, they still love their buildings, and the one in the middle is the Anglican Church, and the one on the right is the historic United Church. So they have these beautiful historic buildings. They don't want to sell them, but by sharing the ministry person, they can keep their ministries alive. Now, their plan was someday they would actually share worship together. And then the pandemic hit, and they started having one worship together on Zoom. And now that they're back in the buildings, they still see themselves as one people, and they alternate between buildings, and whichever building they're in, they use the right of that building with Andrea as their minister for both. And so that's one of the most recent, but it was Nick that alerted me to what's probably the most recent example, at least that we know of. There may be others that have happened along the way, and that's in Nokomis. And so right here in Saskatchewan. And in September of 2022, now Nick tells me that it took a long time it isn't as though a church just decides one Sunday that it's time to move on and they do something the next Sunday. They'd had a long time of reflecting on what their future might be as a church in St. Patrick's Roman Catholic Church. And they realized they could no longer support the needs of their building. And so they got into conversation with Christ Anglican Church and began in September to share one building together. Now, this is an older picture before they were sharing, but this is from just before they started to share together. And but it's kind of neat, the story of St. Patrick's. It had originally been a garage, and a mechanic's garage, and then for 75 years it served as the Roman Catholic Church. And then once it was deconsecrated, it became a new arts center for the town of Nokomis. So it still lives on and has a special purpose in the community, and the Catholic and Anglican communities can continue to enjoy their fellowships without the burden each of them having a building. So that's just a little taste of some of the history of shared ministry in Canada. So what is a shared ministry? Well, some of you may have seen the Ecumenical Shared Ministries Handbook. We can certainly point you to it if you haven't, and you can find it free on the website of Anglican-United, Lutheran, and Presbyterian church websites. It's people sharing, worshiping and serving God in a unified way while still maintaining their denominational identity and connection. So the key thing here is that a shared ministry is it's like an interchurch family where the people have decided they're not going to just give up one denomination and go to the other, but that they're going to share things, but they're going to maintain also their historic connections and their links and their identity with their denomination. So they're not giving up the important gifts of their own denomination, but they're sharing them. And so in a shared ministry, we say it's simply two denominations or more sharing at least one of a building, worship, ministry people, program, or outreach, or maybe all of it. And so that's what it formally is. They operate within a covenant agreement or a shared ministry agreement. They have different names for them. In the United States, they call them a constitution, and that they've shaped under the oversight of their denominational judicatories. And I put that in red because that's your bonus word for coming to this webinar. If you didn't know it before, adjudicatory, that's the word we use to kind of as an overarching term or an umbrella term to describe all the people that might be give oversight in different denominations. So we have different names for those people in our different denominations, but when we're in shared ministry, we we have an umbrella term. We call them judicatories, or for MAD, we call them judicatories, but and so that's the diocese, the presbytery, the region, the synod that has responsibility and oversight for us. So those people we'll talk about it more later, but they're involved in this planning. This doesn't just happen without their support and their advice and encouragement. So who participates? Well, it's really hard to get a bead on how many shared ministries there are in Canada. There's a wonderful shared ministries directory, an ecumenical shared ministries directory on the Prairie Center for Ecumenism website, pcecumenism.ca, right? I think, yes. And so, but trying to get a rough handle on it, it seems like about these are the number of ministry, denominate or congregations or pastoral charges or parishes, and then the percentage. So you see that Anglicans are involved in about 84% of shared ministries in Canada, partly because historically their partnerships were mainly with the United Church, because Anglican and United are the most sort of evenly spread denominations, Protestant denominations across Canada. And then, so they were historically with the United Church, and then full communion with the Lutheran Church brought them into sharing with Lutherans as well. The United Church comes next, but only just ahead of the Lutherans. So the Lutherans are very big into sharing for their smaller size, right? And the Presbyterians are also involved, both in Western Canada and in some parts of Maritime Canada as well. The Roman Catholics may be involved in more, but there are 7 that we know of, and there may be more. The Christian Church Disciples of Christ, although a small denomination, very active ecumenically, and is involved in 2, one in Manitoba and one in Alberta, in Calgary. The Mennonites are involved in 2, the Moravians in 1, and the Baptists in 1. And you see there an example of another one in BC, in northern BC, Chetwynd Shared Ministry, and it's 4 ways: Anglican, Lutheran, Presbyterian, and United. So just as an example. So why do they do this? Well, you can kind of imagine, but I did a survey a few years ago of every shared ministry. Of course, they didn't all respond, but this is what I heard from the ones that did. I got about just over a third did respond. And this is what they said. Well, first of all, you wouldn't be surprised. Practical and financial necessity. That was very important to 69% of them, somewhat important to 31%, and nobody said it wasn't important. So obviously, finances, practicalities lead the way. But look at this, right behind, close behind, very important and somewhat important, the desire to provide a more unified witness in the community. And for those of you who were here last week at that wonderful presentation that we heard from Norman about greening the church, he talked about how a community garden in front of a church could really kind of be a witness to something bigger than just the denominational life of the church. And I think that's what people find in shared ministries. Like they realize they will be a better Christian witness if they witness together, because they show they kind of remove some of that notion that, well, why would I listen to Christians? They don't even listen to each other, kind of thing, right? So I thought what Norman said also could apply to this. It's interesting. And then also this kind of curiosity about one another, not quite as strong, but still very important, or somewhat important to most of the people that are involved in shared ministries, wanting to know the other better. We know each other often, we know each other in every other way in communities except in church. And so this is that opportunity to do that. And then also, again, not as important, but still there, was the opportunity to share programs, Sunday schools, youth groups, messy church, things that people can do together. My experience in Churchill Falls, the few young people who would have just been in the United Anglican congregation, because Churchill Falls was a small town, about 800 people. That wouldn't work. But if they could get together with the Catholics, and then they could get together with all those other Catholics from that other community, well, now you had something going on, right? So sharing programs plays a role for some shared ministries and in their formations. But why would you try it theologically then? These tend to be some of the reasons that people do it, but what's the theology that brings people to this? And I have a quote here from Reverend Claire Holmes, who was interviewed after he had served in shared ministries in northern Vancouver Island for quite a number of years in the early days when this was all a new idea. And primarily Anglican United, although in northern Vancouver Island, they also shared buildings, and they still do, with the Catholic Church. And he said, oh, the thing that always annoys me is people say, oh, you just want me to get into this for the economics. And he says, there's a text, I think, about that, to be blessed and poor. I think it is neat that we did, in fact, need each other. Maybe we are rich because we needed each other. So he kind of reminds us that that economic need, it does not represent a failure of Christian witness, but as a reality for Christians, and that responding to that can bring us new gifts that we didn't expect to have. And then from a much more recent document, a very recent document, it's a follow-up to a study that some of you will know about called The Church Towards a Common Vision of the World Council of Churches that came out in 2013. They've now assessed the responses that they received, and they've produced this little booklet. And I hope everybody can download it online from the World Council of Churches website. It's called, oops, that's the wrong one. Here's the little booklet. What are the churches saying about the church? And they kind of summarize some of the things they heard. And one of the things they heard in responses to this question of what are we saying about the church is that people are not waiting for official ecumenical achievements, but they have a determination to act together locally and to receive the gift of unity in anticipation. So that sense that these little sharing experiences in our case, parts of Canada, are actually gifts that of sharing in anticipation of the unity that we seek for the whole church. And so so that's a bit of the theology. And now I said I'm going to introduce you to a few more churches, and then we will have some time for chatting. These are just ones that I think have a cool story to tell. And this one is that one of those Disciples of Christ churches, Broadway Disciples United, formed in 1997. Out of 2 United Church congregations and 1 Disciples of Christ congregation. And they came together in a church that had been a beautiful old downtown church in Winnipeg. It had burned down, a United Church, and been rebuilt. So it was Broadway, St. Stephen's Broadway, beautiful church, but the congregation was old and dying. And the church was up for sale, and the congregation was going to close. But there was this little Filipino Disciples of Christ church in the vicinity that was in Winnipeg, but it was worshiping in a small building, kind of out of the way. They wanted more presence in the life of the Winnipeg community. So they said to the United Church, could we share maybe in something together? And they said, and the presbytery said, oh, sorry, no, that church is closing. They're old, let them die. And they said, well, we can't really afford the church. We can't buy it, but we have $1. So they cooked up a deal to buy the church for $1 so they could talk about sharing. And then another little Filipino United Church, who were just worshiping in a borrowed space, came in together, and they decided they would try having a few services together. And then they had their Palm Sunday service together, and it was amazing. And they walked with their palms around this beautiful big old building, and they waved them, and they sang, and they had such a wonderful experience. They said, "We're never going back." And they've been together ever since. And so you can see there now, somebody can tell us who that person in the red clergy shirt is. Again, a United Church person should know that one.
It looks like our present moderator, Richard Budde.
Very true. That's who it is. So there's Richard Budde visiting. And you see that the people in this congregation, the person on the right is the most recently arrived minister, and his name is Noel Sumistrado. He's originally from the Philippines. Of course, we now have in the United Church, of course the United Church people know this, we have a mutual recognition full communion agreement with the disciples of Christ. So people can share across denominations, share ministry across denominations. So Noel has been their minister for a few years, but you can see they still have some of the old time United Church folks who generally were not of the original building, who were not Filipino. But what happened was, when they got together, many of the Filipinos were immigrants who had left their grandparents behind in the Philippines. And so a lot of the older people that had been in the original United Church became kind of adopted grandparents to a lot of the little Filipino children. And a beautiful friendship and relationship has developed. So that's kind of a neat story, I think. Now it's over to the Catholics to tell us who this person is. Can anybody tell us who that is? And he's now one of our saints. Well, I mean, not officially yet, but
it's Bishop Remy Deru.
Correct. Thanks, Nick. So Bishop Remy Deru just died at the beginning of February, but he was the youngest. He was, I think, the youngest bishop in the entire meeting of the Second Vatican Council in the 1960s. He was certainly the youngest bishop from Canada, and he was the bishop of, I believe it's called Victoria, but that's the Vancouver Island bishop. He worked tirelessly for the causes of the Second Vatican Council, which included the impetus for ecumenical life. And so he worked with the Anglican bishops and the United Church Presbytery first of all, to develop ministries where they shared ministry and buildings together. So this particular sharing that I'm telling you about happened in Port Alice, in northern Vancouver Island, in St. John's Ecumenical Church. Although the Catholics today call it, they call their parish St. Teresa's, but it's all in one building. But at the time, in the early 70s, there was so much caring and sharing going on. I talked with Bishop Deru about this, and he said, how could I deny the people the opportunity to share in the Eucharist together? Well, of course, Catholics and Anglicans and United Catholics do not share in the Eucharist together with Anglicans and United yet, formally. But they developed the Port Alice Liturgy, which is a liturgical rite based on one of the canons of the Catholic Church. So it satisfied the needs of the Catholic Church, but it had language that was also accessible to the Anglican and United Churches. And they agreed that one Sunday per month, they would come together with three clergy, one from each denomination. And they would each bring their own elements to consecrate, and they would do the service together. And then at the time of communion, people would come forward, and they were supposed to go to the station of their own church, although I've heard nobody policed that. And they still occasionally celebrate this liturgy, although not as frequently as they did. But what a bold and creative way to share ministry. So not only did the Catholics share the building with the Anglican-United Church, which was a shared ministry, but they were even able to share in denominational life together. Well, if you think that's cool, let me take you, and this is courtesy of my my friends with whom I wrote the book that Cheryl mentioned, the Daring to Share, Mitzi and William. And Mitzi visited these two churches and that I'm going to tell you about. And first of all, Spirit of Grace in Beaverton, Oregon. And it's Evangelical Lutheran, so it's Evangelical Lutheran Church of America, very similar to our Lutheran Church in Evangelical Lutheran Church in Canada, and it's Roman Catholic. And it was founded by a small group of individuals and families, and this is in their language, who believed that conversation and prayer across religious lines was worth the struggle. And so in 1986, they came together determined to be one worshiping community. And they've managed to make it work ever since. And how they are able to do this, and of course they have to have the permission of all the people involved. The Lutherans and the Catholics are able to share their liturgy right up to the end of the word and the prayers of the people. And then when they share the peace together, they then move into separate spaces, and they take turns who stays in the main hall or worship space, and who goes into a room beside to celebrate the Eucharist separately. And then they all come back together for the coffee hour after the worship. And the picture there is a little bit old. It was the Catholic priest at the time, and I think that has changed, but also the Lutheran minister or pastor, Pastor Laurie, and Pastor Laurie went and got herself elected bishop of the Lutheran Synod. So she's not there now. There's another Lutheran minister. But I like this picture in part because apparently, according to my friend Mitzi, who visited, the kids all called her Father Laurie because they figured if you're up there at the front, you're Father somebody. So she was Father Laurie to the congregation, to the shared ministry congregation. And another one that's similar is on the other side of the American coast, on the other coast, and that is the Church of the Holy Apostles in Virginia Beach. And here another Episcopal, in this case Anglican and Roman Catholic ecumenical community that was founded again, this one in the 1970s. So again, out of all that fervor from Vatican II that we are intended to be one. Many of the people that I've met some of the people at a conference that are members of this church, and quite a few of them were from interchurch marriages. So they were married across Anglican and Catholic lines, and they did not want to be separated even for a time on Sundays from each other. And they wanted to be able to raise their families in one church together. So they were able to form a shared Anglican Roman Catholic church together. Now, they used to worship something like the people in Oregon, where they could come together and they only had to separate at the time of the actual mass, the consecration. And in their case, they actually, for a while, they were even going to two different altars in the same space. Since then, the Catholic bishop has insisted on a full Catholic liturgy. So they have two consecutive Eucharistic liturgies, one after the other every week, and most of the people stay for both. That's how powerfully they want to represent this sharing, and they do as much as they can that's non-Eucharistic midweek in shared liturgies and Bible studies. And what they say is in their covenant, they say, we choose love over division, unity over separation, and Christ above all things. That's how they talk about what they do. Well, how do we get started in this? And again, if you and I don't see people, so please feel free just to jump in and say something or put it in the chat and make sure that I hear what it is. Generally, people get started when they start talking about their needs. What do we need to be able to do our ministry? What does our community need from us? What does our community need in the way of our ministry? And then who are our natural ecumenical partners or friends? Who are the people that we already get along with in different ways? Do we share something with people? And often, especially in our smaller communities, but also in our cities, there are things we already share, right? So what do we share that we might be able to, and who and with whom? Well, let's start a discussion with them. Start small, get a few people together to see what they think. Maybe start with the main presenting issue. Do you need to leave a building, sell a building as they did in Nokomis? Do you need to pay for ministry personnel as they did in Fernie? Do they have an outreach project that they want to share? Is there something that you could do better by sharing, like a midweek youth program or something? Most of them, don't start out to say we're going to do everything together the way they did in Virginia Beach. We want to be in all in. They start small and say, what is it that we could share together? Try some things together and see what works. See what happens if you share a building for a few weeks or a few months and see how it goes, or have a few shared services together and see what happens. Ask yourselves, are there others that might want to join? Who else in the community is looking for partners and ways to cooperate? Now, those are some of the first steps that we tend to ask people to think about. And then we say, next step, then what? Remember that J word, judicatories, include them in the discussion. So early on, you get the people involved who have oversight of your denominational life. You find out who your bishops, your diocesan personnel are, your synod or region or presbytery staff. Who are these people? And usually you can find them. So there's Andrea Brennan there, dressed in her alb and stole. And then Kathy Davies from the United Church, and Lynn McNaughton, who was then the bishop and now is the archbishop for the Anglican Church in Fernie region. And the Kootenays is the name of their diocese. And their support is necessary along the way. The other thing, though, that really is helpful, and although it was prepared by the Anglican-United Lutheran and Presbyterian churches, it has resources that even if you're not one of those, you might find helpful. A free handbook, again, available on our websites of our churches, and it walks you through some of the processes, some of the issues. It has a great glossary of terms. It tells you, how to, it tells you how to understand what a canon is, because it's a different thing in one church than another. And it's a really helpful resource. And so to be recommended for anybody. And I say non-Paul churches because it just happens that the first letter of Presbyterian, Anglican, United, and Lutheran is Paul. Another saint of. And then if things go along well, people work out a shared ministry agreement or covenant. And there's a whole list of things that might be involved in that. And you can see the list there: property, assets, membership, who belongs to what, governing council, how are you going to govern this thing? Because you need some denominational decision-making people as well as the whole congregation if you're going to be completely integrated. Pastoral leadership, if you're going to share clergy. Worship, who and how and who decides. Now, you saw that some people worship with rotating patterns, like in Fernie. This week it's Anglican, next week it's United. In some shared ministries, it's three-way: United, Lutheran, Anglican, and pastor's choice over the course of a month. Other places, they have permission to use a more blended form of liturgy. And so you need permission if you, in certain denominations for how liturgy unfolds. You need permission in every denomination to perhaps, but it may be more locally provided. So you figure out who has that responsibility. How are you going to think about financial support, records? How are you going to handle conflict? Each denomination has some conflict, management structures. Just whose are you going to use or how? An opting out clause. You don't want to do it, but in case it has to happen, it's helpful to say, how does it happen? How do you orient new people to this ministry, including lay people who might come in the door as well as clergy? How will you review it? Now, that's a lot of stuff. So remember, it doesn't all have to happen at once. It can start small. And just before we opened it to anybody to sort of have a comment, is there anyone that's been in shared ministry that would like to say something about that process, about your process, or how it happened for you, or what made it work for you? And be good to hear from.
Anyway, this is Nora talking, and I was in a shared ministry at Spiritwood with Anglican, Lutheran, and United. Now,
Right.
I didn't know all these rules, but we had one service every Sunday, but communion we did once a month, and we alternated between denominations, because if you didn't use a Lutheran book, they didn't know it was Lutheran, or vice versa. But actually it was wonderful. They had done a lot of work, and so that was my thing, that we were one in Christ. And so getting appointed there was like a blessing for me, because I had been a Lutheran for 23 years when I was called into the United Church, and God does strange things. But at the same time, I got to know the Anglican brothers and sisters much better. And what I discovered is that the Anglican and Lutheran bishops and leaders were more supportive of my ministry than the United.
Interesting, Nora. Thank you for that wonderful example. Yes, Spiritwood, wonderful three-way sharing. And I hadn't realized that you had that Lutheran history, so that makes it really neat. Thank you. Anyone else want to tell us? I think Wilma wants to say something.
Hi, Sandra. Nice to see you again.
Nice to see you. Well, I can't see you at the moment, but I will in a minute. Yes.
Brian and I came back to BC, and we served ALEC, Anglican, Lutheran, Ecumenical. And during the time we were there, sadly, everybody ran out of money for clergy.
Right.
And so they did disintegrate. The churches still exist. Brian takes care. So and everything's friendly, but it was an interesting time. I was really happy to do that. But now I'm here in Estevan, and I'm pretty sure there's some of the other folks from Estevan that are here, that we are in these beginning stages where we're talking. We're coming together and we're talking, and there's traditional things that we've always done together and continue to do. But I think it's gradual. I was probably looking over the next 5 to 10 years, something like that.
Okay. And who are you talking with?
Lutherans, the ELCIC, and the United Church.
Okay, and you're Anglican, just so people know. Yeah,
and
that's
I'm Anglican,
great.
yeah.
Right.
And it began while there was no clergy in the Lutheran or United Church.
Okay.
So
yeah,
it was good timing.
Great. Thank you, Wilma. Interesting stories. Yeah. Yeah. And I should just you do point out something important. And that is that sometimes people say, oh, look at that shared ministry fell apart. Well, shared ministries happen in the most vulnerable places, right? Yeah. So sometimes those communities just can't sustain it, even sharing, but they give it a shot. They make it work for as long as they can. So thanks for that little piece, as well as great news about Estevan. Yeah. I think I see Amanda's there, right?
Yes. Hi, Sandra.
Yeah. Hi.
I haven't served in a shared ministry as such, but while I was serving as moderator for the PCC, I got the chance to visit several that the Presbyterians are involved in. And one of the ones that I visited was in the Presbytery of Quebec, and in three towns, Kinnears Mills and Inverness, and I'm forgetting the third name. but 2 United Churches and 1 Presbyterian. And what they had at the time, a Presbyterian minister serving them, who's since retired recently. But what I thought was so interesting was because the towns were separate, they were probably about half an hour drive-ish apart. And so she explained it as kind of like having a 3-point charge, except the minister doesn't just go around to the 3, but the whole congregation goes around. So they had a cycle of a schedule of which building they would be in. And they needed to keep track of that. They would all go around. Neat. And interestingly, the day that I visited, also the Anglicans in town all showed up too, because it was a week. They didn't have someone coming to do a liturgy for them. And they said, oh, the Presbyterian moderator is coming. And so it had that extra element, and just a wonderful, wonderful community of hospitality and enthusiasm of this shared ministry. The other thing I think is interesting, I don't know if this is right, but they told me that they'd been doing something like this, some kind of shared ministry, since 1946.
It could be. I have to confess, I haven't been to the archives in Quebec because they're scattered all over different parts of Quebec, and it's hard to find. But that's not surprising to me. Yeah,
quite wonderful.
Isn't that neat? And I love that sense that, the Anglicans came to join. I think it does happen. Once sharing starts, others feel more welcome to join. I know people in other places who have said that. And of course, when the moderator came to Churchill Falls, the Catholics came too. So that's neat. Yeah. Thank you. That's a great story, Amanda. You know what? I'm going to we're getting, it seems to make more sense for us to look at each other. So let's, I'm going to stop sharing for the moment and just, then we can all see each other and talk about if there are other people that want to talk and chat, have things to say. Yeah.
Sandra, it's Cheryl. I just want to point out a couple of things that have come through in the chat.
Okay, great.
Susan Anholt was saying that Rosetown has a shared Anglican Lutheran congregation.
Right.
Priest is Anglican and they alternate liturgies on a weekly basis. And Debbie raised a question earlier. When you said that economic need does not represent a failure, you remember what you said at that point, because she wanted to write it down.
Oh,
it's when you were talking about where Reverend Claire was.
Right. Thank you. Yeah. Well, I guess I don't know if I remember the exact words, but the idea that he was trying to get across that economic need didn't mean that people had failed in their Christian duty, but that it provided an opportunity for a new way to witness to the gospel. So just to kind of not see it as failure, but as opportunity, I guess. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah. And Ian, you had, I think I see Ian's hand.
Thanks. I just wanted to share, I grew up in a Saskatchewan shared ministry in Porcupine Plain, where they'd actually picked up the Anglican Church and moved it next door to the United Church, which conveniently had been built on a double lot, and built a little connection in between, which became the choir vestry. And eventually one of the buildings was known as the church and the other was the Christian Education Building. Right. So they both came in for good use. But one of the things, sadly, of course, none of that's there anymore. It's as you talked about, kind of the reality of being in a community that's declining as a whole, or where Christian faith as a whole is declining in its presence in the community. But I also think back to, and I've said before that I was 11 before I discovered that you could go to a church that was only one denomination. But there was a certain cognitive dissonance to that, because when I went to other places and I had to go to an Anglican church or a United Church, and I did try to go to both, but neither of them felt quite right, because they didn't have that sense of being together that I'd grown up with. And so I wonder kind of what responsibility the rest of the church has to people who have that kind of ecumenical experience, because we talk about that in relation to interchurch families, but we don't talk about it as much in relation to ecumenical shared ministries.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I had fun with that in Churchill Falls. The young people were really mad that they had to be confirmed into one denomination or another, and they told the bishop off. And now he's in the Southern Cone, but we don't know if that was the reason. So that's a really interesting theological question to follow up on, Ian. Thank you. Yeah, for that great personal experience. And Kim, Hey, a shared ministries
Hello.
veteran. Yes, hi, nice to
Yeah,
see you.
I am a veteran. I was in a full communion parish for, we'll say 15 years. I'm not sure exactly. I'm presently serving only an Anglican parish, but and it started, I'm going to say, in a very practical necessity kind of thing. I worked very hard to try and make it much more of a full communion parish. I'm not sure everybody embraced the full communion philosophy as much as I did, but there were some who did. But because it was to an Anglican Lutheran parish in one community, those congregations still had their own buildings and still do. I think sometimes the buildings can be something that physically keeps people apart, but actually, mentally and theologically keeps them apart a little bit. And so they can stay in their spaces, right? And they go to the other when they're required to. And some went to the other voluntarily, or when we did things together, which basically there were some things that I just said, we have to do this together. But there were some really high moments there. The confirmation class that I taught together, classes that I taught together, those kinds of things. And there were other pretty frustrating times. And those, I think that's just kind of normal. So I left in August. They presently are still together as a parish, at least in name. They're not really functioning as a parish so much. Although I have left the parish, I still serve as the archdeacon for the Anglicans. So it's a very odd thing to be still connected to them. And there are people in the community who, in the Lutheran Church, who I'm quite close to. So I do get the odd text now and then from so-and-so or so-and-so, and it's a little bit more of just friendly updates. We still live in Melville, which has made it a little bit awkward. We just bought a house in Yorkton, so we are moving, which probably will help some of that thing, just for me personally.
Right.
Then I can just be the visiting archdeacon, not the archdeacon who lives 2 blocks over,
Right.
who is serving another church 30 miles up the road. But for me personally, as a clergy person, full communion was awesome. Like, I loved serving full communion. I love working with other denominations, and I always joked that I could speak Anglican and Lutheran. But it actually isn't a joke. It actually is something that is, you have to be really intentional about learning. And but those were, and for me to go from one to the other on a Sunday was not a personal issue, or I didn't have to make a big switch in my head or anything. So I think the blessings outweigh the challenges, if people are willing. And like you said about Alec, sometimes the times change, or something changes, or populations change, and maybe it's time to make a change. Boundaries and different kinds of things change all the time. So there's no reason why you have to stay with
right.
when you started dancing with, right? If something else works better. So I think for the most part, the blessings outweigh the challenges. So
right now, I see a couple. Thank you, Kim. And as I said, you've been in it a long time, and you really know what it is. Really appreciate that wide perspective. I'm a little conscious of time, and I see Anne and Wilma still. So maybe Cheryl and Nick, do you want me to? Is there time to hear from? Maybe I'll take Anne and then Wilma, just because Anne hasn't spoken yet. Would that be?
Yes, and there's a question in the chat too.
Yes,
and then maybe we'll move.
Yes, I will just say I do. As far as I know, they're still worshiping together. Because of the pandemic, I haven't had as close contact with those folks, but I have until the pandemic, certainly the Lutheran and United Church were worshiping together in Young, Saskatchewan. Yes, yeah, in the Lutheran building, but as one congregation. Yeah. And Anne.
I guess I just wanted to say something about this, building on one of your slides, Sandra. You said the slides of why do they try it, and then factors and ecumenical shared ministry. And yeah, most ecumenical shared ministries start from a needs-based place. We don't have enough money and or enough people. But what is so great is so the congregations come together out of this, in this failure-based model kind of thing. We have failed, therefore we have to do this. But it is such a cool, wonderful thing as a clergy person in the midst of that to help the people build their relationships with one another, however that makes sense for the communities. And when they get to the point where they can't live without each other, and they do that by worshiping together. They do it by eating together. They do it by doing ministries in the community together, and all those different things. But it's, as a clergy person, it's working to build those relationships to the point where the people cannot live without each other. So.
Oh, that's beautiful, Anne. Thank you. Now, Wilma, did you have another short comment? I know we're at time here.
I guess it's not so much it's a comment as a question. It's about buildings. Kim sort of brought it up, and buildings can be such a stumbling block. We have 3 congregations that would happily get together. Theologically, we know we're different, but it's a workable situation. Buildings are not workable situations at this point, at least. And any hints or tips?
Well, every community is a little different, and it always helps if somebody's roof caves in or something happens that the furnace has to be replaced, and then suddenly the building is more of a challenge. I mean, that was never good to have those kinds of problems, but so if you can roll with it until people realize that there's more to the ministry than their buildings, or they can find another use for their building that might be supported. It's hard. It's much, I don't know that there's a perfect answer to that. I know that people have worked really hard, like Anne and Kim and others, to work on those building issues, I think. Yeah, thank you. Well, I know we're at time, so I should probably, I'll just wrap up. I won't go back to slides. Well, okay, I'll share my my last, just briefly share what I wanted to take from this is sort of this issue of helping each other on the journey. And I think people have talked about that. Think about yourselves as doing something that you're sharing gifts, you're not competing, you're experimenting. And then Claire Holmes, the fellow who I quoted before, he said, what we want to think about is, I'm most anxious to have added to my life the riches of your ways. So thinking about learning and receiving gifts from the other. Now, whether that helps when there are buildings at stake, I'm not sure, but it might help a little bit to get people thinking about what it means to be sharing. And then finally, coming back to that pot of gold on St. Patrick's Day, a treasure hidden in the field, is there one near you? Maybe. And that will take us to the end of my time with you. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sandra. And you've given us a lot to think about, and I really appreciate that, what you were saying in terms of that last slide as well, about starting and seeing it as an experiment and looking for the richness that can come from that. And I wanted to make one comment, which, because I didn't earlier, but with what Ian was saying, having worked as a campus as a campus pastor or chaplain, the same question he raised as someone who grew up in an ecumenical framework, I think is true for a lot of people who gather together on universities or college campuses, and then find it hard to find a denominational home because they're used to a different kind of openness and sharing across. And sometimes they just don't find one, and they don't go anywhere and don't become involved. And I think that says something about what we might need to do as churches altogether. So lots of thank yous in the chat, and I'm going to say ours formally. So thank you again, and thank you for all of you who participated through the chat with your voices as well. A few announcements. This is the third of our series. It's recorded and will be found on the YouTube channel of the Archdiocese of Regina and the YouTube channel of the Diocese of Coppell and on the Diocese of Coppell website. So share the word or come back to get those things that you wanted to get but kind of missed and watch it again. Next week, our topic is loving our neighbors, again, in brackets, with Carla Leon and Zoe Chaters of the EDGE Network of the United Church of Canada. And they'll engage us in the question of how we practically interact with our communities and use our physical resources in mission for the good of all. The third thing I want to say is evaluations will be coming on this. And so when you get them, please respond, because they're helpful in the planning of what we do next. I'm going to ask Murray to draw us together in a closing prayer. Murray Patswold is a member of the Ecumenical Planning Committee and an authorized lay minister for the ELCIC, Evangelical Lutheran Church in Canada, Quad Parish, which is Govan, Duval, Quinton, and Raymore. Murray, would you close us in prayer?
Thank you, Sandra, also for your presentation today, and let you know briefly that we have a wonderful example here in Regina where it's called Living Spirit Center, where the Anglicans, United, and Lutherans worship together. And that I'm a part of a shared ministry also out at Quad Parish. So let us pray. Oh God, we thank you for the words that we have heard today. We thank you for your servant, Sandra. Thank you for her challenging us to be able to think of things differently. And we commend her to your tender care. And as we commend her to their tender care, we're also mindful of our brothers and sisters in the Ukraine. We pray for those that spread the gospel, that they would not be ashamed, and that somehow, somewhere, your divine intervention might take place, that your name might be glorified. For we pray this in our Savior's name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Murray. And thank you, everyone. We'll see you next week. Thanks for joining us.